The cold February wind howled through the streets of Bentonville, Arkansas, like a living thing, cutting through fabric and flesh with equal cruelty. And Franklin Carson knew that if he did not get his horses settled soon, the storm would claim them all before morning broke. The year was 1878, and winter had descended upon the frontier town with a vengeance that reminded every soul of nature's supreme authority over human ambition. Franklin had just returned from a cattle drive that had taken him through 3 states, his pockets heavy with payment, but his heart heavier still with the loneliness that had become his constant companion since he had buried his father 2 years prior. The stable door fought against his efforts, the wood swollen from moisture and ice, but Franklin put his shoulder into it and forced his way inside with his horse trailing behind him. The interior offered little warmth, but at least provided shelter from the wind that threatened to strip the skin from his bones. He guided his mare, Daisy, into her stall and began removing her saddle, his fingers stiff and clumsy in the cold. The familiar smell of hay and horse filled his nostrils as he worked, a scent that had always brought him comfort in its earthy simplicity. He was reaching for a brush when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself it was merely the wind playing tricks through the gaps in the wooden walls. But there it came again, a soft whimper that raised every hair on the back of his neck. Franklin froze, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip, though he could not imagine what threat might be lurking in his own stable. He stood perfectly still, controlling his breathing as his father had taught him during those long-ago hunting trips, and listened. The sound came from the far corner, behind the hay bales he had stacked just before departing on his cattle drive. Franklin moved slowly, his boots making soft, crunching sounds in the scattered straw on the floor. As he rounded the hay bales, he stopped so suddenly he nearly lost his balance. There, curled into as tight a ball as the human body could manage, was a woman dressed in nothing but a thin cotton dress that had once been blue but was now stained with mud and what looked like blood. Her lips had taken on a disturbing purple hue, and her skin appeared almost translucent in the dim light filtering through the stable's cracks. "Jesus Christ," Franklin breathed, immediately dropping to his knees beside her. He touched her shoulder gently, afraid that she might already be dead, but at his touch her eyes fluttered open. They were green, he noticed, the color of spring grass, though now they held a glazed quality that spoke of hypothermia's dangerous embrace. She tried to speak, but her jaw trembled too violently to form words, and Franklin could see that she was barely conscious. Without hesitation, Franklin shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat, the one his father had worn for 20 years before passing it down to him. The cold immediately attacked his own body through his wool shirt, but he ignored it as he wrapped the coat around the woman's shaking form. She was so cold that touching her felt like pressing his hands against winter itself, and he knew that the coat alone would not be enough to save her life. "I am going to pick you up now," he said, though he doubted she could understand him in her current state. "I need to get you into the house where there is a fire. Try to stay with me." She weighed almost nothing in his arms, as though the cold had somehow consumed her substance along with her warmth. Franklin kicked open the stable door and ran across the yard toward his small house, the wind tearing at his clothes and stealing his breath. The distance could not have been more than 50 feet, but it felt like miles as he struggled against the storm's fury. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, thick flakes that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now seemed malevolent in their abundance. The house was dark and cold, as he had left it weeks ago, but Franklin had anticipated this and had prepared kindling and wood in the fireplace before his departure. He laid the woman on the floor near the hearth, close enough to benefit from the heat once he got the fire going, but not so close that sparks might catch her dress. His hands shook as he struck the match, though whether from cold or fear he could not say. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking at the larger logs he had arranged with practiced efficiency. As light filled the room, Franklin got his first real look at the woman he had found. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark brown hair that hung in tangled waves around her pale face. The blood he had noticed earlier came from cuts on her feet, which were bare and torn from what must have been miles of walking. Her dress, beyond being inadequate for the weather, was ripped in several places, and Franklin felt anger rising in his chest as he considered what circumstances might have brought her to such a state. "Can you hear me?" he asked, kneeling beside her again. The coat had fallen open and he tucked it more securely around her. "Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved and he leaned closer to hear the whisper that emerged. "Mary," she managed. "Mary Lawrence." "Mary," Franklin repeated, committing the name to memory. "I am Franklin Carson." "You are safe now. I'm going to take care of you, but I need to get you warm. Do you understand?" She gave the smallest nod, her eyes already sliding closed again. Franklin knew the danger in letting someone with hypothermia fall asleep, but he also knew he needed to work quickly to raise her body temperature. He grabbed every blanket he owned from the bedroom, returning to pile them on top of her. Then he filled his kettle with water from the pump and set it near the fire to heat. While he waited for the water to warm, Franklin examined Mary's feet more carefully. The cuts were deep in places, and he could see embedded dirt and small stones. He would need to clean them thoroughly to prevent infection. His medical knowledge was limited to what any frontiersman learned through necessity, but he had tended enough injuries to know the basics. He gathered clean cloths, whiskey for disinfecting, and the needle and thread his mother had left behind when she died giving birth to his stillborn sister. The water had reached a suitable temperature, so Franklin poured it into a basin and carefully lifted Mary's feet into it. She gasped at the sensation, her eyes flying open. "I know it hurts," he said softly. "The feeling coming back is always painful, but it is a good sign. It means we are not too late." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes as Franklin gently cleaned her feet, removing the debris and washing away the blood. Up close, he could see that she had delicate features, the kind that belonged to someone who had been raised with at least some degree of comfort. Her hands, though dirty, did not bear the calluses of someone accustomed to hard labor. Who was she, and what had brought her to his stable in the middle of a winter storm? "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Franklin asked as he worked. "Who did this?" Mary's jaw still trembled, though whether from cold or fear he could not determine. "My husband," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Former husband, I ran." Franklin's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their careful ministrations. "You are married." "Was," she corrected, her voice gaining a bit of strength from the warmth beginning to seep into her bones. "He died 3 weeks ago, thrown from his horse, but his brother came. Said I belonged to him now, said it was his right. I disagreed." The simple statement held volumes of terror and courage. Franklin had heard of such situations, particularly in more isolated areas where law held less sway than tradition and might. A woman alone, especially one with any property or assets, could find herself claimed like chattel by relatives who saw opportunity in tragedy. "You did right to run," he said firmly. "A woman is not property to be inherited." "His brother did not see it that way," Mary said, wincing as Franklin began to thread his needle. "He and his friends came for me. I waited until dark and ran. I have been walking for 2 days, I think. Maybe 3, I lost track." Franklin felt his anger building again, but he forced it down to focus on the task at hand. The stitching required steadiness and precision, and Mary deserved better than to bear additional scars because he could not control his temper. "This will hurt," he warned before making the first stitch. Mary bit down on her lip, but made no sound as he worked, closing the deeper cuts with neat stitches his mother would have been proud of. By the time he finished bandaging both feet, true warmth had finally returned to the room. Mary had stopped shivering quite so violently, though she still shook periodically. Franklin made a decision that he knew some might consider improper, but that simple human decency demanded. "You need to get out of that wet dress," he said, keeping his voice matter of fact. "I will turn my back and you can change into one of my shirts. It will be too large, but it is clean and dry." He retrieved one of his better shirts from the bedroom, placing it near her before turning to face the wall. He heard the rustle of fabric, a small gasp of pain as movement pulled at her injuries, and then her soft voice saying, "I am decent now." When Franklin turned back, Mary sat wrapped in his blankets with his shirt hanging nearly to her knees. The firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and for the first time he noticed the beauty that terror and cold had previously hidden. But more than her appearance, he found himself struck by the strength he saw in her eyes. This was a woman who had walked for days through winter cold rather than submit to a fate she had not chosen. That took a kind of courage he had rarely witnessed. "You must be hungry," Franklin said, moving toward his small kitchen. "I do not have much here as I have been away, but I can make coffee and biscuits. There is some jerky that should still be good." "Anything would be wonderful," Mary said, her voice still weak but clearer than before. "I have not eaten since I left. I was afraid to stop anywhere people might be." "Afraid they would send me back." Franklin set about making the simple meal, his mind working through the implications of Mary's presence. Bentonville was not a large town, and strangers were noticed. If her brother-in-law came looking, and Franklin had no doubt that he would, it would not take long to track her here. The question was what to do about it. He could take her to the sheriff, but he knew Sheriff Dawson to be a man who valued peace over justice, and might well decide that sending Mary back was easier than dealing with angry men making accusations. "Where did you come from?" Franklin asked, as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Your husband's ranch, I mean." "Outside of Fayetteville," Mary answered, accepting the coffee gratefully and wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Thomas, my husband, had a small ranch. Nothing grand, but it was ours. His brother Silas has a much larger spread nearby. When Thomas died, Silas came with papers he claimed gave him ownership of everything. I do not know if they were real or forged, but he had the backing of his men and I had no one. Fayetteville was nearly 30 miles north." That she had covered such distance in winter with no shoes or coat spoke to her desperation. Franklin handed her a biscuit, waiting as she took small bites. He could see her forcing herself to eat slowly, though hunger clearly urged her to devour the food. "Did Thomas have no family who would help you? Parents? Siblings besides Silas?" Mary shook her head. "His parents are both dead. There was only Silas. My own family disowned me when I married Thomas. They wanted me to marry a banker from Little Rock. When I chose Thomas instead, my father said I was no longer his daughter." A bitter smile crossed her face. "I suppose he got his wish in the end. I am no one's daughter, no one's wife, and soon to be no one's anything if Silas has his way." "You are someone," Franklin said with quiet intensity. "You are Mary Lawrence, and you are a person with rights and dignity. That does not change because men with more muscle than morals say otherwise." The words seemed to hit Mary with unexpected force. She set down her coffee cup and covered her face with her hands, and Franklin realized she was crying. Not the delicate tears from earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. He hesitated, unsure of the appropriate response, then decided that propriety mattered less than comfort. He moved closer and put a tentative arm around her shoulders, offering what solace he could through simple presence. "I am sorry," Mary gasped between sobs. "I am sorry. I should not fall apart like this. I have been so frightened, and no one has been kind. The world has been so cruel for so long that I had forgotten kindness existed." "You have nothing to apologize for," Franklin said, surprised by the protectiveness he felt toward this woman he had known for less than an hour. "You have survived something terrible. You are entitled to tears." They sat that way for a long while, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside while Mary cried herself empty of fear and grief. Franklin found himself thinking about his own loneliness, the hollow feeling that had pervaded his life since his father's death. He had told himself he preferred solitude, that the quiet of his small ranch suited him. But holding Mary as she wept, offering what comfort he could, he recognized the lie he had been living. He had not preferred solitude. He had simply been afraid of more loss. When Mary finally pulled away, wiping at her eyes with the edge of the blanket, the first hints of dawn were beginning to show through the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. "I should let you rest," Franklin said. "You can have my bed." "I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Mary protested. "You have already done so much." "You have injuries that need rest to heal," Franklin countered. "The bed is yours for as long as you need it. We can discuss what comes next after you have slept." Too exhausted to argue further, Mary allowed Franklin to help her to the bedroom. The room was small and Spartan, containing little more than the bed, a dresser, and a chair. But the bed itself was well made with a thick mattress and plenty of blankets. Mary sank into it with a sigh of relief, her eyes already closing. Franklin pulled the blankets up around her, then quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. He spent the next hour tending to his horses and surveying the damage from the storm. Several shingles had blown off the stable roof, and one of his fence posts had snapped, but overall things could have been much worse. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Mary and her situation. He knew that keeping her present secret would be nearly impossible in a town the size of Bentonville. Someone would see her, word would spread, and eventually Silas would hear of it. The question was whether Franklin was prepared for the confrontation that would inevitably follow. He was no gunfighter, though he could handle a weapon competently enough. He had no particular standing in the community that would lend weight to his protection of Mary. He was simply a man with a small ranch, trying to make an honest living in a hard land. But as he thought of Mary's torn feet and desperate courage, he realized that none of that mattered. Some things were simply right, and helping her was one of them. When Franklin returned to the house, he found Mary still sleeping soundly. He took the opportunity to clean up properly himself, washing away the grime of travel and changing into fresh clothes. Looking in the small mirror above his wash basin, he saw a man of 26 years who looked older than his age, courtesy of sun and wind and hard work. His face was lean, his brown hair in need of cutting, and his blue eyes held a seriousness that had settled there the day he realized his father was truly gone. The day passed quietly, with Mary sleeping and Franklin catching up on small tasks around the property. He made a pot of stew, knowing that Mary would need substantial food when she woke. As evening approached, he finally heard sounds from the bedroom. Mary emerged looking better than she had the night before, though still pale and moving carefully on her bandaged feet. "How are you feeling?" Franklin asked, gesturing for her to sit at the small table. "Sore," Mary admitted, "but warmer and grateful." She looked around the simple house with curious eyes. "Do you live here alone?" "I do now," Franklin said, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "My father built this place when he first came to Arkansas. He died 2 years ago and my mother passed when I was young. It has been just me since then." "It must be lonely," Mary said softly. Franklin considered denying it but found he did not want to lie to her. "It is," he admitted. But loneliness seemed safer than the alternative. "Everyone I have loved has left, one way or another. After a while, it seemed easier not to love at all." Mary nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I know something of that. I thought loving Thomas would be enough to build a life on. And perhaps it would have been if we had been given more time. But time is a luxury not everyone receives." They ate in companionable silence for a while before Franklin broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind all day. "We need to discuss what happens next," he said. "This Silas will come looking for you. It is only a matter of time. We need to decide how to handle that." "I have been thinking about the same thing," Mary said, setting down her spoon. "I cannot ask you to fight my battles. You have already saved my life. The kind thing for me to do would be to leave before I bring trouble to your door." "And go where?" Franklin challenged. "You can barely walk. You have no money, no supplies, and winter is far from over. If Silas does not find you, the cold will finish what it started." "Then what do you suggest?" Mary asked, frustration evident in her voice. "I will not go back to him. I would rather die in the snow than become his property." Franklin had been considering this throughout the day, and an idea had formed that seemed outrageous but might just work. "What if you were not available to be claimed?" He said slowly. "What if you were already married to someone else?" Mary stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock. "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting? A marriage of convenience," Franklin clarified quickly. "Not a real marriage in the sense of. That is to say, it would be legal protection, nothing more, unless—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Unless what?" Mary prompted. "Unless over time it became something more," Franklin finished, feeling heat rise in his face. "But there would be no pressure, no expectations. Simply a legal arrangement that would protect you from Silas." Mary was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do this for me?" she finally asked. "You do not know me. I could be anyone. I could be lying about everything." "You could be," Franklin agreed. "But I do not think you are. And even if you were, even if every word you told me was false, you were still freezing to death in my stable. That part was real. The fear in your eyes was real. I will not pretend to understand all my reasons for wanting to help you. Perhaps it is simply that I have been alone too long and have forgotten what it means to care about another person's welfare. Or perhaps I see in you something worth protecting. Either way, the offer stands." Mary's eyes had filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the ones she had shed the night before. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Such generosity seems impossible. People are not this kind, not in my experience." "Then perhaps your experience has been too limited," Franklin said gently. "I know mine has been. Maybe we both deserve the chance to learn that the world can be different than what we have known." "And if Silas comes, if he challenges this marriage?" Mary asked. "Then we deal with it together," Franklin said firmly. "I am not a violent man by nature, but I will protect what is mine. And if you agree to this, Mary Lawrence, you will be mine in the eyes of the law and God. That makes you my responsibility and my privilege to defend." The weight of the moment seemed to settle around them like a physical presence. Mary studied Franklin's face as though trying to read the truth of his character in his features. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she slowly extended her hand across the table. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I accept your proposal, Franklin Carson. Let us enter into this strange arrangement and see where fate takes us." Franklin took her hand, struck by how small it felt in his own. Her skin was soft despite everything she had endured, and he found himself wanting to protect that softness from the harshness of the world. "We will go to town tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the preacher. Make it legal before word spreads that you are here." That night, Mary slept in the bedroom while Franklin again took the floor by the fire. But this time, the house felt different. Not empty, but full. Full of possibility and hope, and the strange comfort of knowing another human soul breathed within the same walls. Franklin lay awake long into the night, wondering at the turns life could take. Just 2 days ago, he had been returning from a cattle drive, looking forward to nothing but the familiar routine of his solitary existence. Now he was planning a wedding to a woman he had known for mere hours, preparing to defend her against threats he could only imagine, and feeling more alive than he had in years. The morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow sparkling like diamonds in the sunlight. Mary emerged from the bedroom wearing the dress Franklin had cleaned and dried overnight. It still bore stains that would never come out, but at least it was presentable. He had also fashioned makeshift shoes for her from leather and cloth, knowing her bandaged feet could not go bare. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Mary took it, and together they walked into town. The journey took nearly half an hour, with Mary moving slowly due to her injuries. Franklin found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way she leaned slightly against him for support, the scent of the soap she had used that morning, the determined set of her jaw as she pushed through obvious pain. Bentonville was beginning to stir as they arrived, shop owners opening their doors and early risers going about their business. Franklin could feel eyes turning toward them, curiosity evident on every face they passed. He knew that by afternoon, the entire town would be buzzing with speculation about the mysterious woman on Franklin Carson's arm. The church was a small white building at the center of town, its steeple reaching toward the clear blue sky. Reverend Thomas Mitchell was sweeping the steps when they approached, a kindly man in his 50s who had always treated Franklin with fairness. "Franklin," he called out in greeting, "good to see you back from your drive. And who might this be?" "Reverend Mitchell, this is Mary Lawrence," Franklin said. "We have come to ask you to perform a marriage ceremony." The Reverend's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "A wedding? My, but this is sudden. I was not aware you were courting anyone, Franklin." "It is a somewhat unusual situation," Franklin admitted. "But we are both of age and sound mind, and we are quite certain of our desire to marry. Would you be willing to perform the ceremony today?" Reverend Mitchell's gaze moved from Franklin to Mary, taking in her worn appearance and the makeshift shoes on her feet. Franklin could see the questions forming in the Reverend's mind, the concern of a man who took his spiritual duties seriously. "Might I speak with Miss Lawrence alone for a moment?" the Reverend asked. Franklin looked to Mary, who nodded. "Of course," he said, stepping back. Mary followed the Reverend into the church, leaving Franklin to wait on the steps. The minutes seemed to stretch as he wondered what they were discussing. Was Mary telling him the truth of her situation? Was the Reverend trying to talk her out of what must seem like an impulsive decision? Franklin paced the small area, his anxiety growing with each passing moment. Finally, the church door opened and Mary emerged, followed by Reverend Mitchell. The Reverend's expression was serious but not disapproving. "Miss Lawrence has explained the situation," he said. "While I have some concerns about the haste, I understand the necessity. However, I must ask you both to understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not merely a legal convenience. If you enter into this bond, I expect you to honor it with all the seriousness it deserves." "I understand, Reverend," Franklin said. "I would not propose this if I did not intend to honor my vows." "And you, Miss Lawrence?" the Reverend asked. "I understand as well," Mary said firmly. "I may not have expected to marry again so soon after losing my first husband, but I do not take this lightly. Franklin has shown me extraordinary kindness. I will do my best to be a good wife to him." Reverend Mitchell nodded slowly. "Very well, but we will need witnesses, and I should like to wait until this afternoon to perform the ceremony. That will give you both a few hours to be absolutely certain this is what you want." Franklin agreed, and they arranged to return at 2 o'clock. As they left the church, they nearly collided with a woman coming up the steps. She was perhaps 40 years old, handsomely dressed in a green wool coat, with sharp eyes that took in every detail of Mary's appearance. "Franklin Carson," she said, her voice rich with curiosity. "I heard you were back in town, and with a companion, I see. Mrs. Patterson," Franklin said, recognizing one of Bentonville's most dedicated gossips. "May I present Mary Lawrence? Mary, this is Constance Patterson. She runs the general store with her husband." "Charmed," Mrs. Patterson said, though her expression suggested she was more intrigued than charmed. "Lawrence, you say? Any relation to the Lawrence family up in Fayetteville?" Franklin felt Mary stiffen beside him. "A distant connection," Mary said carefully. "Nothing worth discussing." "I see," Mrs. Patterson said, clearly seeing quite a bit more than they wanted her to. "Well, welcome to Bentonville, dear. I am sure we will be seeing more of each other." She swept into the church, leaving Franklin and Mary to continue on their way. "That will be all over town within the hour," Mary said quietly. "I know," Franklin replied. "Are you having second thoughts?" Mary stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes searching his face. "Are you? This is your last chance to back out before you tie yourself to a woman you barely know and all the trouble that comes with her." Franklin considered the question seriously, knowing she deserved an honest answer. "I am not having second thoughts," he said finally. "Are you?" "No," Mary said. "Strangely, I am not. Perhaps I should be. Perhaps I am making a terrible mistake. But when I think of the alternative, of trying to face this alone, I find I would rather make this mistake with you than the safe choice by myself." They spent the intervening hours walking around town, with Franklin pointing out various landmarks and introducing Mary to those they encountered. Each introduction brought fresh curiosity and thinly veiled questions. By the time they returned to the church at 2 o'clock, Franklin felt exhausted from maintaining a pleasant facade while revealing as little information as possible. Reverend Mitchell was waiting for them, along with 2 witnesses he had recruited, the church organist, Mrs. Sarah Winters, and the town doctor, Henry Matthews. Both greeted Franklin warmly and Mary with polite curiosity. The ceremony itself was brief but solemn, with the Reverend reading from the Book of Common Prayer and leading them through their vows. When Franklin said, "I do," promising to love, honor, and cherish Mary for as long as they both lived, he was surprised to find that he meant it. Not in the abstract sense of honoring an agreement, but with a sincerity that caught him off guard. Looking into Mary's eyes as she made the same promises, he saw a similar surprise reflected there, as though she too had not expected the words to feel so real. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Mitchell intoned. "Franklin, you may kiss your bride." Franklin hesitated, suddenly aware that they had not discussed this part. But Mary solved the dilemma by rising on her toes and pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. It was chaste and brief, but Franklin felt the touch like a brand, marking him irrevocably as someone who was no longer alone. They signed the marriage certificate, the witnesses adding their names, and then it was done. Mary Lawrence had become Mary Carson, and Franklin had acquired a wife. The Reverend offered his congratulations and blessings, and Dr. Matthews mentioned that he would like to examine Mary's feet at some point to ensure they were healing properly. Mrs. Winters invited them to Sunday dinner the following week, an invitation Franklin accepted knowing that refusal would only fuel more speculation. As they walked back to Franklin's house, now their house, the reality of what they had done began to settle over them. They were married, legally bound, partners in whatever came next. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, and Franklin found himself thinking that it was the most beautiful winter evening he could remember. "So," Mary said as they approached the house, "what now?" "Now we figure out how to live together," Franklin said. "How to make this work. How to become partners in truth as well as law." That night, Franklin again offered Mary the bedroom while he prepared to sleep by the fire, but Mary stopped him with a hand on his arm. "This is your house," she said. "Your bed. I cannot keep taking it while you sleep on the floor. That is not how partners behave." "I do not mind," Franklin protested. "You are still healing." "The bed is large enough for two people to share it without impropriety," Mary said, her cheeks coloring but her voice firm. "We are married now. There is no reason we cannot share the space, provided we both respect the boundaries we have set." Franklin knew she was right, though the thought of sleeping in the same bed as Mary filled him with a confusing mixture of anticipation and anxiety. "If you are sure," he said. "I am sure," Mary replied. They prepared for bed in awkward silence, each changing in separate rooms before meeting in the bedroom. Mary had donned a nightgown Franklin had purchased that afternoon from a somewhat scandalized Mrs. Patterson, while Franklin wore his usual nightshirt. They climbed into opposite sides of the bed, maintaining a careful distance between them. "Good night, Mary," Franklin said into the darkness. "Good night, Franklin," Mary replied. Despite his exhaustion, Franklin lay awake for a long time, hyper-aware of Mary's presence beside him. He could hear her breathing, feel the slight movement of the mattress when she shifted position. It was both strange and oddly comforting to share the space with another person after so long alone. Eventually, lulled by the warmth and the soft sounds of her breathing, Franklin drifted into the deepest sleep he had experienced in years. He woke to find pale morning light filtering through the window and Mary's head resting on his shoulder. She was still asleep, her face peaceful in repose, one hand curled against his chest. Franklin held perfectly still, afraid to wake her but also reluctant to disturb the unexpected intimacy of the moment. This was not what they had agreed to, this closeness, but it felt so natural that he could not bring himself to pull away. Mary's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she seemed confused about where she was. Then awareness returned and she jerked back, her cheeks flaming red. "I am so sorry," she stammered. "I did not mean to. That is, I must have moved in my sleep." "It is all right," Franklin said, surprised to find he meant it. "No harm done." They went about their morning routines with exaggerated politeness, both trying to pretend that waking up in each other's arms had not affected them. But Franklin could not stop thinking about how right it had felt, how perfectly Mary had fit against him, how much he wanted to experience that feeling again. Over the following days, they settled into a routine. Franklin tended to his horses and took care of the outdoor work while Mary, despite her injured feet, insisted on helping with cooking and household tasks. They talked during meals, gradually learning about each other through the sharing of stories and memories. Franklin learned that Mary loved to read, that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, that her favorite color was blue like the morning sky. Mary learned that Franklin played the harmonica, that he had a weakness for apple pie, that he had once wanted to see the ocean but had never traveled farther east than Memphis. They also learned to navigate the peculiar intimacy of sharing a home. The first time Mary saw Franklin without his shirt, having just woken and forgotten she was there before going to wash, she had turned away with furious blushes. The first time Franklin accidentally walked in while Mary was brushing out her hair before bed, he had stammered an apology and fled. But gradually, these moments became less awkward and more familiar, a natural part of their shared life. A week after their wedding, they were eating dinner when they heard the sound of horses approaching. Franklin looked out the window to see 5 men dismounting in his yard, their faces hard and their intentions clear even from a distance. "Mary," he said quietly, "go into the bedroom. Take my rifle. If something happens to me, bar the door and do not open it for anyone but Sheriff Dawson." "Franklin, no," Mary said, her face going pale. "That is Silas, the tall one with the scar. If you face him, he will kill you." "He will not," Franklin said with more confidence than he felt, "because I am not going to give him reason to. We are going to handle this the legal way. Now please go to the bedroom." Mary hesitated, then grabbed his hand and squeezed it tightly. "Be careful," she whispered. "Please, I have already lost one husband. I do not think I could bear to lose another." The words struck Franklin with unexpected force. Another husband. She had called him that, and from the look in her eyes, she meant it as more than just a legal designation. He squeezed her hand back, then gently pushed her toward the bedroom. "I will be fine," he promised. Hoping it was true, Franklin stepped out onto his porch as the men approached. Up close, he could see that Silas Lawrence was indeed a hard-looking man, tall and broad with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. The 4 men with him had the look of hired guns, dangerous men who sold their violence to the highest bidder. Franklin kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, even as his heart hammered in his chest. "Franklin Carson?" Silas asked, his voice a deep rumble. "That is right," Franklin confirmed. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" "I am looking for my sister-in-law," Silas said. "Mary Lawrence. I have reason to believe she is here." "I am afraid you are mistaken," Franklin said calmly. "There is no Mary Lawrence here." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Do not play games with me, Carson. She was seen in town with you. Now bring her out here before this gets unpleasant." "I said there is no Mary Lawrence here," Franklin repeated. "However, there is a Mary Carson, my wife. We were married a week ago by Reverend Mitchell. You are welcome to verify that with him if you doubt me." The expression on Silas's face was truly frightening. "The hell you say?" "That woman is my property. My brother's widow belongs to me." "Your brother's widow belonged to no one but herself," Franklin corrected. "And now she is my wife, legally wed in the eyes of God and the territory of Arkansas. Whatever claim you think you had ended the moment she said I do." One of Silas's men stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun. "Boss, let me handle this. We can be rid of him and take the woman within 5 minutes. And hang for murder," Franklin said, keeping his voice steady, "because that is what would happen. I am a law-abiding citizen on my own property. Kill me and you kill any claim to Mary you might have dreamed up. The law would hunt you down and you would swing for it. Is that really worth it?" Silas held up a hand, stopping his man from drawing. "You have made a powerful enemy today, Carson. This is not over." "I hope it is," Franklin said, "because I have no quarrel with you beyond protecting my wife. Leave us in peace and we will do the same for you. Continue to threaten us and I will be forced to take the matter to the authorities." Sheriff Dawson may not be the most aggressive lawman, but even he cannot ignore threats of violence. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, wills clashing in the cold morning air. Then Silas spat into the snow and turned away. "Let us go," he growled to his men. But this is not over, Carson. Not by a long shot. Franklin stood on his porch until the men had mounted and ridden away, his legs trembling with reaction. Only when they had disappeared from sight did he allow himself to sag against the porch railing, his breath coming in great gasps. He had faced down 5 armed men and lived. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Mary burst from the house and into his arms, the rifle clattering to the porch as she threw herself at him. "You are alive," she gasped. "Oh God, Franklin, you are alive." "I thought for certain he would kill you." Franklin held her tightly, feeling her shake against him. "I am fine," he murmured into her hair. "We are both fine, and he is gone." "For now," Mary said, pulling back to look at him with worried eyes. "But he will come back. Men like Silas do not give up so easily." "Then we will deal with it when it happens," Franklin said. "Together." That night when they climbed into bed, Mary did not maintain her careful distance on her side. Instead, she moved close to Franklin, resting her head on his shoulder as she had that first morning. "Is this all right?" she asked softly. "More than all right," Franklin replied, wrapping an arm around her. It felt natural, right, as though they had been sleeping this way for years instead of days. "Mary, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "When I asked you to marry me, I said it was just for protection. A legal arrangement, but somewhere along the way it stopped being just that for me. I find myself thinking about you constantly, worrying about you, wanting to make you smile. I do not know when it happened, but my feelings have changed." Mary was quiet for so long that Franklin wondered if he had made a terrible mistake in confessing his feelings. But then she tilted her head up to look at him, and he could see tears glistening in her eyes. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I thought I was betraying Thomas's memory by caring for you so quickly, but I cannot help it. You have been kinder to me than anyone in my entire life. You risked yourself for me today without hesitation. How could I not love you for that?" The word love hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Franklin cupped her face in his hands, thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Properly this time." Mary's answer was to close the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held all the longing and hope and new love they had been dancing around for days. It was gentle at first, exploratory, but deepened as they poured their feelings into the embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Franklin felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. "I love you, Mary Carson," he said, testing out the words and finding them true. "I love you too, Franklin Carson," Mary replied, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing their hopes and dreams and fears, building the foundation of a real marriage to replace the convenient fiction they had started with. Mary told him about her childhood, about parents who had valued social standing over happiness, about meeting Thomas at a church social and recognizing in him a kindred spirit. Franklin told her about his father's death, about the loneliness that had haunted him, about the moment he had found her in his stable and felt his entire world shift. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Franklin and Mary's love continued to grow. Mary's feet healed under Dr. Matthews's care, and she took on more of the household responsibilities with cheerful efficiency. But she also began to make the house truly theirs rather than just Franklin's. She sewed curtains from fabric purchased at Patterson's store, planted an herb garden near the kitchen door, and filled the space with small touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a shelter. Franklin, for his part, found himself working harder than ever, driven by a desire to provide well for his wife. He took on extra jobs in town, saved every penny he could, and began to dream of expanding his small operation into something more substantial. But more than the work, he treasured the evenings spent with Mary, talking and laughing and learning the thousand small intimacies that made up a life together. They attended church together every Sunday, weathering the curious looks and occasional whispers with the confidence of two people who knew the truth of their relationship. Reverend Mitchell watched them with what seemed like satisfaction, as though pleased that his concerns about their hasty marriage had proven unfounded. Mrs. Winters became a friend to Mary, introducing her to other women in town and helping her establish her place in the community. Not everyone was welcoming. Some of the older women looked askance at Mary, suspicious of her sudden appearance and quick marriage. There were whispers about her being Thomas Lawrence's widow, though no one seemed to know the full story. And there were occasional sightings of Silas or his men in town, though they made no direct moves against Franklin and Mary. One warm April afternoon, Mary was in the garden when she heard horses approaching. Her heart seized with fear, thinking Silas had returned, but when she looked up, she saw Sheriff Dawson riding toward the house with another man she did not recognize. Franklin emerged from the stable, wiping his hands on his pants, his expression wary. "Sheriff," Franklin greeted. "What brings you out here?" Sheriff Dawson dismounted, his weathered face serious. "Franklin, Mary, this is Marshal Coleman from Fort Smith. He has some questions for you." The marshal was a stern-looking man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Mr. and Mrs. Carson," he said formally, "I am investigating some allegations made by a man named Silas Lawrence. He claims that Mrs. Carson here is his legal ward and that you coerced her into marriage." Mary felt the blood drain from her face, but Franklin stepped forward protectively. "That is a lie, Marshal. Mary came to me of her own free will, fleeing from Silas's attempts to claim her as property. We married legally and with full consent on both sides." "That may be," the marshal said, "but I still need to hear from Mrs. Carson herself. Madam, did this man force you to marry him in any way?" "Absolutely not," Mary said firmly, moving to stand beside Franklin. "My husband saved my life. He found me freezing in his stable and offered me protection through marriage. It was my choice to accept, and I have not regretted it for a single day." Marshal Coleman studied her face for a long moment. "Silas Lawrence claims you were not of sound mind when you agreed to this marriage, that you were confused and desperate and taken advantage of by an opportunistic stranger." "Silas Lawrence is a liar," Mary said, feeling anger override her fear. "He wanted to claim me as property after my first husband died. When I refused and ran, he pursued me. If I had been confused about anything, it was in ever thinking I could trust a member of the Lawrence family besides Thomas. Franklin is twice the man Silas will ever be." "Strong words," the marshal observed. "Can anyone corroborate your story?" "Reverend Mitchell can attest to our marriage," Franklin offered. "He spoke with Mary alone before agreeing to perform the ceremony. He can confirm that she was willing and aware of what she was doing." "I already spoke with the Reverend," Marshal Coleman said. "He vouches for both of you, but I needed to see for myself. Silas Lawrence is a man with considerable influence in these parts. If his allegations were true, I would need to act on them. And now that you have seen they are not true?" Franklin asked. The marshal allowed himself a small smile. "Now I can report back that Mrs. Carson is exactly where she wants to be and that no crime has been committed. Silas will not be happy, but the law is the law. You are legally married and there is nothing he can do about it." Relief flooded through Mary with such force that her knees went weak. Franklin's arm came around her waist, steadying her. "Thank you, Marshal," he said. "Just doing my job," Marshal Coleman replied. "But a word of advice. Silas Lawrence is not a man who takes defeat well. Watch your backs. If he cannot use the law against you, he may try other methods. After the marshal and sheriff had left, Franklin and Mary stood in the yard holding each other. "It is really over," Mary whispered. "The law recognizes our marriage. Silas cannot claim me anymore." "Not legally," Franklin agreed. But the marshal was right. "We need to stay vigilant. Men like Silas do not give up easily." The threat hung over them like a shadow, but they refused to let it diminish their happiness. Spring turned to summer, and the land around Bentonville burst into vibrant life. Mary's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Franklin's horse breeding business began to gain a reputation for quality, bringing in steady income. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, content. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Franklin would play his harmonica while Mary sang, her clear voice carrying across the fields. They would talk about their plans for the future, about maybe expanding the house, about the children they hoped to have someday, about growing old together on this land they both had come to love. It was during one of these evenings in late July that Franklin finally voiced the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Mary, do you ever regret it? Marrying me, I mean. You could have gone somewhere else, started fresh without the complications of a husband." Mary set down the mending she had been working on and looked at him with such love that it took his breath away. "Not for a single second," she said. "Franklin, you gave me more than just protection. You gave me a home, a purpose, and a love I never knew existed. Thomas was a good man and I cared for him, but what we have is different, deeper. We chose each other not out of social expectation or family pressure, but because we recognized something true in each other. How could I ever regret that?" Franklin pulled her close, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness he felt. "I love you," he said against her lips, "more than I knew it was possible to love another person." "And I love you," Mary replied, "my brave, kind, wonderful husband." That night, their marriage became complete in every sense. What had started as a convenient arrangement had transformed into genuine love, and they celebrated that love with a physical intimacy that left them both awed by the depth of connection they shared. Afterward, lying in each other's arms in the darkness, Franklin felt a completeness he had never experienced before. He was no longer alone. He was part of something bigger than himself, bound to another person not just by law or convenience but by choice and love and commitment. August brought scorching heat and news that made Franklin's blood run cold. One of Silas's hired guns had been found dead outside a saloon in Fayetteville, killed in what appeared to be a dispute over cards. But two of the other men who had ridden with Silas that day to Franklin's house had disappeared, and rumors suggested they had been sent on a specific mission. When Franklin heard this from a traveling merchant, he immediately increased his vigilance, making sure his guns were always loaded and within reach. His caution proved justified when, on a sweltering afternoon in early September, Mary was hanging laundry when she heard a sound that made her freeze. The distinctive click of a gun being cocked. She turned slowly to find two rough-looking men standing at the edge of the yard, both armed. "Mrs. Lawrence," one of them said with a mocking smile. "Or should I say, Mrs. Carson, Mr. Lawrence sent us to collect you. He figures if he cannot get you legal, he will get you anyway." Mary's mind raced. Franklin was in town picking up supplies and would not be back for at least an hour. She was alone with two armed men who clearly had no good intentions. "I will not go with you," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My husband will come looking for me." "Your husband is going to have an unfortunate accident on his way home," the other man said. We have friends waiting on the road. By the time anyone finds him, you will be long gone and no one will be able to prove anything." Terror shot through Mary, but with it came a fierce determination. These men were threatening Franklin, planning to kill him, and she would die before she let that happen. Her eyes darted around, looking for any weapon, any advantage. The laundry basket sat at her feet, and beside it was the knife she had been using to cut rope. It was not much, but it was something. "I said I will not go with you," Mary repeated, slowly bending as though in submission but actually reaching for the knife. Her fingers closed around the handle just as the first man stepped forward to grab her. What happened next occurred in a blur. Mary swung the knife up, catching the man across the forearm. He howled in pain and stumbled back. The second man raised his gun, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the direction of the house. The gun flew from his hand and he grabbed his wrist, cursing violently. Mary whirled to see Franklin standing on the porch, his rifle smoking. "Get off my property," he commanded, his voice cold as winter ice. "And tell Silas Lawrence that if he ever comes near my wife again, I will put a bullet in him myself." The wounded men scrambled for their horses and fled, leaving a trail of blood and curses behind them. Franklin ran to Mary, who had dropped the knife and was shaking violently. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, running his hands over her as though checking for injuries. "I am fine," Mary gasped. "But they said they had men waiting on the road for you. They said they were going to kill you." Franklin's face went hard. "We need to get to town and talk to the sheriff. This has gone too far." They rode together into Bentonville, and this time Sheriff Dawson could not ignore the situation. With Mary and Franklin's testimony, along with the evidence of the attack, the sheriff organized a posse to ride to Silas's ranch and arrest him. Franklin insisted on going along, driven by a need to see justice done, and to ensure Silas could never threaten Mary again. The confrontation at Silas's ranch was tense but ultimately bloodless. Faced with a dozen armed men representing the law, Silas had no choice but to surrender. He was taken to Fort Smith to face charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted kidnapping. The two men who had attacked Mary were found and arrested as well, and they quickly turned on Silas to save their own necks, providing detailed testimony about his plans. The trial took place in October, and Franklin and Mary made the journey to Fort Smith to testify. It was difficult for Mary to face Silas in court, to recount the fear and terror he had caused. But Franklin sat beside her throughout, his presence a steady source of strength. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, Mary felt as though a weight she had been carrying since Thomas's death had finally been lifted. Silas Lawrence was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His ranch, heavily mortgaged and without his management, was sold to pay his debts. The threat that had hung over Franklin and Mary's marriage was finally, truly over. They returned to Bentonville as the leaves were turning gold and red, the autumn air crisp and clean. Everything felt different now, lighter somehow. They could plan for the future without the shadow of fear hanging over them. They could simply be a husband and wife building a life together. That winter, as snow once again covered the Arkansas landscape, Mary discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Franklin with a joy so profound he could barely speak. They had talked about children, of course, but the reality of it was overwhelming in the best possible way. He became almost comically protective, insisting that Mary rest more and trying to take over all the household tasks. "Franklin, I am pregnant, not dying," Mary finally told him with exasperated affection. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still managing to cook dinner." "But those women were not you," Franklin replied stubbornly, "and those babies were not my baby." Mary laughed and pulled him down for a kiss. I love you, you ridiculous man, but you need to trust that I know my own limits." Their son was born in early summer of 1879, during a thunderstorm that shook the windows and rattled the roof. Dr. Matthews attended the birth, along with Mrs. Winters and two other women from town who had become Mary's friends. Franklin paced the main room, wearing a path in the floorboards as he listened to Mary's laboring cries from the bedroom. When he finally heard the wail of his child, Franklin thought his heart might burst from his chest. Dr. Matthews emerged a few minutes later, grinning widely. "You have a son," he announced. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him. And Mary came through beautifully. You can go in and see them now." Franklin entered the bedroom on shaking legs to find Mary propped up against pillows, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Her hair was damp with sweat, and her face was pale with exhaustion, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Franklin approached as though walking on holy ground. Mary pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, eyes squeezed shut and mouth opened in complaint at being thrust into the cold world. "He is perfect," Franklin whispered, touching one impossibly small hand with his finger. The baby's fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, and Franklin felt tears running down his face. Absolutely perfect. They named him Thomas Franklin Carson, honoring both Mary's first husband and Franklin himself. Little Tommy, as they called him, became the center of their world. Franklin had never imagined he could love something as much as he loved his son. Watching Mary nurse him, seeing her tenderness and patience, only deepened his love for her. The years that followed were full of hard work, but also joy. Franklin's horse business continued to grow, and they were able to add onto the house, building extra bedrooms and a proper parlor. Mary started teaching reading and writing to some of the local children in their home, fulfilling her old dream of becoming a teacher in a different way. Tommy grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's serious demeanor. When he was 3, he became a big brother to Rebecca Ann Carson, named for Franklin's mother. 2 years after that, another son arrived, Samuel, completing their family. Franklin and Mary watched their children grow with wonder and gratitude, never taking for granted the life they had built together. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, they would sit on the porch as they had done since the early days of their marriage and talk about how much had changed. "You remember that first night?" Mary asked one such evening, her head resting on Franklin's shoulder. "When you found me in the stable, I remember thinking you were the most pitiful sight I had ever seen," Franklin said with a smile, half frozen, terrified, and somehow still fighting. "I remember thinking you were going to turn me away," Mary admitted. "That you would tell me to leave and shut the door against me. When you gave me your coat instead, I started to believe that maybe the world was not entirely cruel." "The world gave me you," Franklin said, kissing the top of her head. "How could I ever call that cruel?" They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Tommy would be starting proper school in the fall. Rebecca was already showing signs of her mother's love of books, constantly begging for stories. Samuel was still too young for much beyond eating and sleeping, but he had a smile that could light up a room. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had gone to a different stable that night," Mary mused, "if I had stumbled onto someone else's property." "Do not," Franklin said firmly. "I cannot bear to think about a world where I did not find you, where we did not find each other." "Neither can I," Mary agreed. "You know, when I married Thomas, I thought that was the end of my story. A good man, a simple life, nothing remarkable, and I was content with that. But this, what we have, is so much more than I ever dreamed possible. You are so much more." Franklin turned to cup her face in his hands, looking into the eyes that had captivated him from that first frightening night. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, the absolute best. I was sleepwalking through life before you, just going through the motions. You woke me up. You made me want to be better, do better, live better. Everything good in my life stems from the moment I opened that stable door and found you." They kissed as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other through chance and desperation, and had built something beautiful through choice and love. The lonely cowboy and the freezing woman had become partners, parents, and proof that even in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier, love could flourish and endure. As the years continued to pass, Franklin and Mary became pillars of the Bentonville community. Franklin served on the town council and helped establish a school fund. Mary taught dozens of children to read, never charging those whose families could not afford to pay. They weathered droughts and hard winters, celebrated good harvests and new neighbors, and watched their children grow into fine young people. Tommy inherited his father's way with horses and eventually took over that aspect of the family business. Rebecca became a teacher like her mother had always dreamed of being, opening a proper schoolhouse in Bentonville with her parents' full support. Samuel, the baby, surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for numbers and eventually became a bank clerk in Little Rock. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Franklin took Mary back to the stable where he had found her all those years ago. It had been rebuilt and expanded, now housing a dozen horses instead of just a few. But the spot where he had discovered her remained the same, and they stood there together, hands clasped. 20 years, Mary said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and also like forever. The best 20 years of my life, Franklin said. And I look forward to the next 20 and the 20 after that. We will be very old by then, Mary pointed out with a laugh. I do not care, Franklin replied. Old with you sounds infinitely better than young without you. They returned to the house to find their children had organized a surprise celebration. Friends and neighbors filled the yard, tables groaning under the weight of food. Reverend Mitchell, now elderly but still sharp, stood to offer a blessing. We are gathered here today to celebrate a marriage that began in unusual circumstances, but has become a shining example of what love and commitment can achieve. Franklin and Mary Carson are proof that the best things in life often come when we least expect them, and that opening our hearts, even when it is frightening, is always worthwhile. The party lasted into the night, filled with laughter and music and the warmth of community. As Franklin danced with Mary under the stars, the same stars that had witnessed so many of their evenings on the porch, he marveled at the journey they had taken together. From desperate strangers to devoted partners, they had built a life rich in love and meaning. When they were finally alone again in the quiet house preparing for bed as they had done thousands of times before, Mary stopped Franklin with a hand on his arm. Thank you, she said simply. For what? Franklin asked. For giving me your coat that night, Mary said. For giving me safety and respect and time to heal. For giving me your heart. For giving me this beautiful life. For everything. Franklin pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the familiar shape of her in his arms. You gave me just as much, he said. More even. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. Thank you for stumbling into my stable. Thank you for accepting my ridiculous proposal. Thank you for loving me. Always, Mary promised. For all the years we have left, I will always love you. They climbed into bed, the same bed they had shared for 20 years, and settled into each other's arms as naturally as breathing. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more. The freezing woman had found permanent warmth. Together, they had created something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love and family and proof that even the coldest winter night could lead to the warmest spring. Outside, the Arkansas night was peaceful and calm. Inside, Franklin and Mary Carson slept wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts beating in synchronized rhythm. Two souls who had found their home in each other and would never be lost again. The years continued their inevitable march, bringing both joys and sorrows. Franklin's hair turned silver, and Mary developed the laugh lines around her eyes that came from a lifetime of smiling. They became grandparents, delighting in the next generation while watching their own children navigate the challenges of parenthood. They modernized the ranch as new technologies emerged, though Franklin insisted on keeping some of the old ways that had served him well. When Franklin turned 65, the whole family gathered for a celebration that rivaled their wedding anniversary. Tommy had brought his wife and 4 children. Rebecca came with her husband, a banker from Fayetteville, and their 2 daughters. Samuel arrived from Little Rock with his wife, who was expecting their first child. The house and yard overflowed with people, noise, and love. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Franklin and Mary sat on their porch one more time. They were older now, moving a bit slower, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning?" Mary asked. "When I apologized for falling apart. I said you had nothing to apologize for," Franklin recalled. "That you were entitled to your tears. You gave me permission to be human," Mary said, "to be vulnerable and scared and still worthy of kindness. No one had ever done that before. That was when I started to fall in love with you, I think. Right at that moment. I fell in love with you when you accepted my proposal," Franklin admitted. "The courage it took to trust a stranger to take that leap of faith, it awed me. It still awes me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars that had witnessed their entire life together. "I do not regret a single day," Mary said finally. "Not one. Every moment, good and bad, led us here. Led us to this life, this family, this love. If I could go back and change anything, I would not. Because it all brought me to you." Franklin took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it still fit in his. "When I gave you my coat that night, I had no idea I was also giving you my heart, but I am glad I did. You have taken better care of it than I ever could have." As they prepared for bed that night, moving through the routine of decades with practiced ease, Franklin thought about the gift that Mary had been to his life. He had been existing before her, not living. She had taught him what it meant to truly share a life with another person, to build something together that was greater than either of them alone. They passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, Franklin first and then Mary, both having lived long, full lives surrounded by the family they had created. The town of Bentonville mourned their passing, recognizing that something special had been lost. But their children and grandchildren carried on their legacy, telling the story of how a lonely cowboy had found a woman freezing in his stable and had given her his coat and his heart, and how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had touched countless lives. The little house that Franklin had built and Mary had made into a home remained in the family, passed down through generations. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled and the snow fell, family members would gather there and tell the story of Franklin and Mary, of how love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and how choosing to open your heart, even when it seemed impossible, was always the right choice. Their graves sat side by side in the Bentonville Cemetery under a large oak tree. The inscription reads simply, "Franklin Carson, 1852–1932, and Mary Carson, 1855–1932. Together in life and in death, their love was a shelter from every storm. And so ended the story of the lonely cowboy and the woman he found freezing in his stable, a tale of courage and kindness, of second chances and enduring love, of two souls who found each other in the darkness and created a light that would shine for generations to come.